Chapter 1. A Picturesque Beginning. Little Davington was the sort of English village that seemed untouched by time. Thatched roofs, hedgerows heavy with bloom, and neighbors who still knew one another by name. Yet behind the postcard charm, quiet dramas unfolded in drawing rooms and behind lace curtains. Bramble Cottage, nestled at the edge of the village, had stood for nearly 2 centuries, charming in its disrepair and shaded by a crooked yew tree. When Charles Vaughan and his new bride, Eleanor Gresham, arrived there to begin their honeymoon, the locals peeked through curtains with equal parts curiosity and goodwill. Eleanor, the vicar's younger daughter, had always been beloved in the village. Intelligent, kind-hearted, and far too gentle, some thought, for the world beyond the parish. Charles Vaughan was less well known. Dashing, articulate, and vaguely continental, he had swept Eleanor off her feet during a whirlwind courtship that raised a few cautious brows. He was polite, certainly, and handsome, but something in his gaze didn't quite match his smile. Still, Eleanor had glowed, and no one had wanted to disturb her joy. Only one person had hesitated. Verity Loxley, a longtime friend of the Greshams and a resident of the vicarage guest quarters, had returned to Little Davington after retiring from her decades-long career as a school headmistress in Cambridge. She was unmarried, childless, but rich in life experience, the sort of woman who'd seen many masks slip. She now lived quietly, helping the vicar and his household after Mrs. Gresham's passing and offering calm wisdom to the community. People came to her for everything from forgotten poems to private advice. What she lacked in romantic history, she more than made up for with a lifetime spent observing human nature in its raw, unpredictable form. When the news came that Eleanor had died, in apparent accident while walking near the stream behind Bramble Cottage, the village grieved. But Verity's grief was troubled. Eleanor had been many things, but careless was not one of them. The girl had known the land behind the cottage like the back of her hand. At the inquest, Charles's account was clear. Eleanor had gone for a walk alone, lost her footing, and fallen. A tragic misstep. The verdict was accidental death. But when Constable Davies knocked on the vicarage door 2 mornings later, Verity was not surprised. Chapter 2. A Visitor at the Vicarage. Verity answered the door with her usual composed calm. Constable Davies stood there, cap in hand, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Loxley," he said, clearing his throat. "I was hoping for a word, if you've a moment." "Of course, Constable," Verity said. "Come in." She led him into the sitting room, where books were neatly stacked by the window, and the air smelled faintly of bergamot tea. Verity gestured to a chair. "Something troubling you?" Davies nodded, settling down awkwardly. "I'm not one to pester where there's no cause, but I've had a feeling about this whole business. Eleanor's death, I mean." "Yes," Verity said quietly. "It doesn't sit right, does it?" He looked at her with something like relief. "No. And I knew you'd understand. I've seen you notice things others miss. You've helped the village more times than anyone knows. And you knew Eleanor." Verity inclined her head. "Since she was a child. A thoughtful girl, intuitive, not prone to foolish risk. And she adored that stream behind Bramble Cottage. She wouldn't have slipped there." Davies leaned forward. "There are whispers. Some folk remember hearing things about Vaughan. Another woman, a sudden inheritance. No one can prove anything, but the timing feels off." "Has anyone spoken to his previous associates?" Verity asked. "That's just it," Davies said. "There's no real trail. No family, no firm roots. It's like he stepped out of thin air." Verity sat back, her fingers steepled. "Then we begin with what we know. Eleanor, her habits, her fears. And Vaughan himself," Davies said. "I know I shouldn't say it, but his sorrow, it felt too measured, like a man rehearsing grief." Verity gave a small, knowing smile. "People often forget that real grief is messy. The polished kind tends to hide something. Davies stood. If you notice anything at all, would you let me know? Quietly, of course. I can't launch anything official without reason. Of course, she said. We'll tread carefully. But if there's truth to be uncovered, we won't let it stay buried. As the door closed behind him, Verity turned back to her sitting room. She pulled out a worn notebook and began to write. A habit she had never abandoned since her school days. Names. Dates. A question. Was Eleanor frightened before she died? And if so, why? Chapter 3. Bramble Cottage. A morning after her meeting with Constable Davies, Verity set off toward Bramble Cottage with her walking stick and a canvas satchel. Her gray coat was buttoned neatly, and she wore a felt cloche hat that had seen better years, but suited her sharp, clean features. To any passer-by, she looked every inch the genteel spinster out for a bracing country walk, which was precisely what she intended them to think. The cottage sat quietly under the pale morning sun, its stone walls dusted with moss, the front gate ajar. Charles Vaughan had not yet departed for London, where he claimed urgent business awaited him. For now, he remained alone in the house he and Eleanor had occupied for just 5 short days. Verity knocked. The door was answered promptly. Miss Loxley, Charles said, a hint of surprise in his voice. I wasn't expecting visitors. I won't stay long, she said gently. Just wanted to see how you're bearing up. And if you've had breakfast, the vicar sends his regards. Charles stood aside. Please, come in. The interior of Bramble Cottage was tastefully appointed, not with Eleanor's usual softness, but with cold, curated charm. The sitting room was filled with stiff-backed chairs and sharp-angled furnishings, more like a catalogue than a home. Verity sipped her tea slowly, letting her eyes wander. The room was impeccably neat, the kind of neatness one associated with a property let to strangers. No clutter, no half-unpacked suitcases, no trace of Eleanor's whimsical taste. She would have brought books, certainly, flowers from the hedgerows, a sketch-pad, perhaps. But there was nothing. Would you like tea? Charles offered. If it's not any trouble, Verity said. Charles returned with a tray. He handed her a cup, and they sat opposite each other. Everyone's been terribly kind, he said, but I confess I'm eager to be gone. Too many memories. Understandable, Verity replied, though I imagine Eleanor loved this place. Charles hesitated. She did, yes. Especially the garden and that path by the stream. Verity sipped her tea. She used to walk there every morning as a girl. Always careful. Even had a favorite pair of boots just for wet ground. Charles's fingers tightened around his cup. It rained the night before. Perhaps she misjudged her footing. Perhaps. Verity said. A silence stretched between them, filled only by the tick of a wall clock. Then she rose. I leave you to rest, she said. Do let me know if you need anything. As she walked back through the village, Verity turned over every word in her mind. Charles's story was smooth. Too smooth. That afternoon, she began writing letters. To an old friend who now worked at a Parisian insurance firm. To a former student employed by the Home Office. To anyone who might know something. Or someone who could give information about Charles Vaughan. The truth, she knew, had a way of surfacing. You simply had to dig in the right places. And Verity had brought a very sharp spade. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. 2 days later, a letter arrived at the vicarage. Forwarded discreetly through a friend in Paris. Verity slit the envelope open with her letter opener and scanned the contents with quickening interest. Charles Vaughan had, indeed, taken out a life insurance policy on Eleanor through a subsidiary of a French insurer. The policy had been initiated weeks before the wedding, but had only recently been finalized. Its activation dated precisely to the day of their marriage. The sum was substantial, and Charles was listed as the sole beneficiary. Verity set the letter down and stared out the vicarage window. Insurance was not, in itself, suspicious. Many young couples did it for security. But few arranged foreign policies without clear reason, and fewer still did so in secret. That evening, over a quiet supper, Verity raised the subject with the vicar. Did Eleanor say much about Charles's background, his work, his people? The vicar looked surprised. Not in detail. He mentioned something about import-export work and having lived abroad for many years. Eleanor said he had no living relatives. She seemed content with that, or perhaps didn't want to pry. And you? What did you think of him? The vicar considered. Charming, certainly. Attentive, but guarded, as if he were always performing a version of himself. Verity nodded. It matched what she'd seen. The next morning, she walked to the village post office, where Clara Griggs, the postmistress, kept a quiet ear on everything that passed through. Clara was in her 50s, a sharp-eyed woman with a passion for local drama and a memory like a ledger. "Clara," Verity began, after exchanging pleasantries, "do you remember anything unusual being sent to or from Bramble Cottage recently?" Clara tapped her chin. "Mostly ordinary post. But now you mention it. There was a packet marked legal documents that came from Marseille. Big square envelope. Arrived just before the wedding. I remember because I nearly misdelivered it to Mr. Cray in Lower Davington." "You're sure it was for Mr. Vaughan?" Verity asked. "Oh, yes. I remember the name," Clara answered. "Handsome fellow. Looked like he'd stepped out of a cinema." "Thank you, Clara. Most helpful." As she walked back, Verity's mind raced. Marseille, a hub for shipping, commerce, and certain discreet financial dealings. She scribbled the name into her notebook beneath a growing list of peculiarities. She now had 3 lines of inquiry: the insurance policy, the foreign correspondence, and Charles's elusive past. It was time to draw the net tighter, and for that she would need a very particular kind of help. Enjoying the story so far? If you love unraveling mysteries in quiet villages with sharp-witted sleuths, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more cozy whodunits. Now, back to the mystery. Chapter 5. Threads and Thorns. Verity sent another letter, this one to Felix Rathbone, a former student of hers now working with Interpol in Lyon. A bright boy once, now a capable man, with a fondness for cryptic crosswords and quiet rebellion. She knew he would dig where British officials could not. 3 days later, a reply arrived by express courier. "Dearest Miss Loxley," it began in Felix's careful hand, "you do ask the most curious favors." He went on to explain that Charles Vaughan had no official record prior to 1935, no birth certificate in England, no school record, a ghost before the age of 30. However, one incident had caught Felix's attention. In 1936, a woman named Lydia Moreau had died under suspicious circumstances while honeymooning in a villa outside Nice. Her new husband, claiming to be a French businessman, had been briefly detained but released without charge. No conviction? The man's name on the record? Marcel Duval. But the photograph matched Charles Vaughan. Verity folded the letter with deliberate care and poured herself a brandy, a rare indulgence. Later that day, she made her way to Constable Davies. "There is something you should see," she said, handing over the letter. Davies read it twice. "He's done this before? Or something like it? Enough to warrant further scrutiny. But what now? We've no proof, no witnesses. The insurance can't be used against him unless a criminal act is proven." Verity looked thoughtful. "Then we must make him reveal himself." Davies blinked. "How?" "By laying bait," she said. "Not for him, but for his arrogance." Verity's plan was simple, but delicate. She would speak to Charles again, this time with subtle provocation. And she would involve Clara, whose sharp tongue and reputation for gossip would ensure the conversation would never remain private. She smiled faintly as she left the station. The game, as they said, was afoot. Chapter 6. A Mask Slips. It was a cool Thursday afternoon when Verity Loxley returned to Bramble Cottage for a second visit. The air was damp with the faint scent of rain, and the gray sky hung low over the rooftops. She carried a basket covered with a linen cloth and a note from the vicar expressing his continued condolences. The visit was intended to appear as nothing more than a neighbor's kindness, a grieving widow's friend extending warmth. Charles answered the door in his shirt-sleeves again, his hair slightly mussed, his eyes faintly shadowed. He looked surprised, but quickly recovered. "Miss Loxley, again. I'm flattered. Won't you come in?" "I come bearing baked goods," Verity said lightly, holding up the basket. "Warm scones from the vicarage kitchen, and a message from your father-in-law." He stepped aside to let her in, his smile strained. The sitting room was changed, subtly but tellingly. Eleanor's photograph had been put on the mantel. A shawl of hers hung neatly over the armchair, as if she might return at any moment to reclaim it. But the atmosphere rang false. Verity's gaze caught on the photo. She stepped toward it. "You've arranged things differently," she said. "I thought it would feel more like her, like home," he said. Verity turned, meeting his eyes. "And yet she's no longer here to enjoy it." Charles flinched ever so slightly. "It brings me comfort, that's all." "I understand," she said kindly, accepting his offer of tea. He disappeared into the kitchen, and Verity took the moment to glance around again. Charles returned with the tray. "Lemon or milk?" "Lemon, thank you." She stirred her tea slowly, watching him. "I was speaking to Clara Griggs yesterday," she said conversationally, "and she mentioned something peculiar. A letter from Marseille that arrived before the wedding. Rather official-looking. Odd time to be receiving legal papers so close to your nuptials." Charles's hand trembled slightly as he set down his cup. "Ah, yes. That was a property sale. I've been finalizing a long-standing business matter in France. The paperwork was delayed." Verity smiled gently. The world does have a way of pressing on, even at inconvenient times. "Exactly," Charles said, forcing a chuckle. "Precisely that." There was a pause. Verity took a sip of her tea. "Did Eleanor know about this business matter?" she asked. Charles blinked. "No, I didn't want to trouble her during our wedding. It was merely administrative." "Of course," Verity remarked. She stood to leave soon after, not wanting to press further. Not yet. But outside, she made certain to linger by the garden gate, where Mrs. Clavering from the bakery was passing by with her spaniel. A few well-chosen words drifted easily through the damp air. So thoughtful of Charles to put Eleanor's things out. "But curious, did you hear about the letter from Marseille?" "Right before the wedding. Business, apparently." By that evening, Verity knew the news would have run the length of the high street. That night, by candlelight in her small room at the vicarage, Verity opened her notebook again. She added a fresh line beneath her notes. "He is not grieving. He is performing. And I intend to learn for whom." Chapter 7. Shadows of the Past. Bramble Cottage, viewed from the lane in early evening, looked serene, its rose-covered trellis glowing faintly in the setting sun, the shutters slightly ajar. But Verity Loxley no longer trusted quaint facades. She'd arranged to call on Charles Vaughan under the pretense of delivering a parcel sent in error to the vicarage, one of their wedding gifts mistakenly redirected. She approached with a calm air, the box tucked under one arm and her expression politely neutral. Charles opened the door after only a moment, his sleeves rolled to the elbow and an open book in one hand. "Miss Loxley," he said, forcing a smile that barely touched his eyes. "Come in." "I have brought the package for you that was delivered to the vicarage by mistake," she said. I thought I'd bring it along before the hour grew too late. He stepped aside to let her in. The cottage interior had changed since her last visit. More framed photographs adorned the mantel now. 2 of Eleanor as a child, 1 of her in her wedding gown. A vase of dried lavender sat beneath the window. To any other visitor, it might have looked like the gentle attempts of a widower to honor his wife's memory. But to Verity, it looked like staging. She handed him the box and let her gaze linger. "You've made the place look quite homey." Charles glanced around as if suddenly unsure. It felt strange to leave it bare. She loved beauty, even in the smallest corners. "Of course," Verity murmured. "And have you plans to stay long in Little Davington?" He hesitated. "Just until I can sort through the details, the funeral, the paperwork. And perhaps to London. I haven't decided." She nodded, then turned her attention to a low table cluttered with envelopes. Carefully, without appearing obvious, she noted the seal on one, dark green, foreign. She filed it away in memory. "You're a strong man, Mr. Vaughan," she said as he offered her tea. "I imagine many would crumble under such loss." His jaw tightened, just slightly. "I suppose I'm doing my best." She accepted the tea with a soft thank you, then sipped in silence, letting the moment stretch. "There's something about this cottage," she said. "I've always thought places remember things, even when people forget." He looked at her sharply. "You think this place remembers?" "Perhaps," she said with a small smile. "But more often, it's the people who remember. Or repeat." Later that evening, back in her room at the vicarage, Verity opened her notebook. She looked up the seal she'd glimpsed. The green crest belonged to a firm of underwriters in Marseille. Eleanor had never spoken of insurance. She didn't believe in tempting fate. Verity's hand hesitated over the paper. Then she flipped to a new page and wrote, "Charles Vaughan. Possible aliases: C. Valère, Jacques Morel, C. Van Doren. Investigate Lyon, Lisbon, Marseille." She paused. Beneath that, she added, 3 women, 1 man, 1 method. The wind howled briefly outside, brushing against the window pane like a whisper. Verity stood, walked to the hearth, and added a log to the fire. She stared into the flames. She would not let Eleanor's death disappear beneath paperwork and polite silence. Not this time. Tomorrow, she would speak with Constable Davies, not as a friend, but as an ally. Justice was stirring, slow but sure, and Verity Loxley had always been patient. Chapter 8. Threads Unraveling. Verity rose early the next morning, stirred by a sense of purpose that banished sleep before dawn. By 8:30, she was walking briskly through Little Davington's narrow lanes, a soft mist clinging to hedgerows and rooftops. She carried a folder under her arm, neatly organized notes, clippings, and the names she had written the night before. At the constabulary, Constable Davies was pinning notices to the board in the front room. He looked up as she entered, his brow lifting with cautious interest. "Miss Loxley," he said, "you've something more for me?" "Yes," she said, handing him the folder. "I believe what's inside will convince you that Charles Vaughan is not who he claims to be. I've traced connections to 2 previous cases, both involving a sudden death on holiday, both followed by quiet but substantial insurance payouts." Davies opened the folder, flipping through the pages with growing seriousness. These are quite thorough. Letters, records, even photos?" "I corresponded with a retired investigator in Lisbon," she said calmly, "and a notary in Marseille. Both remembered a man matching Vaughan's description, though he used different names." Davies leaned against the desk. "So what you're saying is, Eleanor wasn't his first?" Verity nodded. "Nor would she have been his last. If he's unsettled by my questions, he may disappear again." Davies looked grim. "I'll need to involve the chief inspector in Kingsbridge, quietly. But if you're right, Miss Loxley, this goes beyond our village." She smiled faintly. Yes, but it began here, and I believe it should end here, too. That afternoon, Verity returned to the vicarage to find a letter slipped beneath her door. The envelope bore no stamp or address. Her name was written in a heavy, masculine hand. Inside, a note read, "You ask questions best left alone. Stop before you bring grief upon yourself." It was unsigned, but she didn't need a name. The warning was clumsy, its tone cold and rattled. He was watching her. He was frightened. She folded the note and tucked it into her notebook, where it joined her mounting evidence. She had rattled the spider's web. Now she only had to wait for the spider to show itself. That evening, the village was thick with twilight. Lights blinked on behind lace curtains. A dog barked far off, and an owl answered from the woods beyond the churchyard. Verity sat in the parlor with the vicar, both sipping their tea. He watched her over the rim of his cup. "You've taken on a heavy thing, Verity," he said gently. "Are you certain you wish to carry it?" "I don't carry it alone," she said. "Not anymore." Eleanor was kind. People like that deserve someone to speak when they no longer can. The vicar nodded slowly. "Then may God keep you sharp and brave." Outside, a car engine started. Bramble Cottage. Verity crossed to the window and pulled back the curtain. Through the hedge, she could just see Charles Vaughan loading a case into the boot of a car, preparing to leave, preparing to vanish, but not fast enough. Verity stepped away from the window and reached for her coat. The time for quiet suspicion was over. The hunt had begun. Chapter 9. A House of Cards. The next morning dawned with a pale sun edging over the rooftops of Little Davington. The chill in the air belied the mildness of the season, but Verity felt no cold as she stepped briskly through the churchyard path toward the lane. In her satchel were not only the letter she had received the night before, folded carefully between the pages of her notebook, but also the documents and records she had painstakingly compiled over the past week. Letters, notes, a copy of a marriage record from Lisbon, an excerpt from a newspaper in Marseille, her own sketches and comparisons. All of it? She wasn't going to Bramble Cottage. Not yet. Instead, she made her way to Kingsbridge. Constable Davies had said he would speak to his superiors, but Verity knew how slowly official channels moved. There might be hesitation, calls to be made, procedures to be followed. She didn't have time for that. Not when Charles Vaughan was on the brink of disappearing. The train was punctual, and Verity used the short journey to review the documents once more. She could feel the threads tightening. It wasn't merely the evidence that mattered now. It was timing. Charles was nearly gone. She arrived at the Kingsbridge police station just before 10 o'clock. Chief Inspector Linton, a heavy-set man with clipped gray hair and a wary manner, met her in a side room, having been urged by Davies to take the matter seriously. Linton glanced over the documents Verity laid before him on the table. Her notes, insurance records, copies of letters, and sketches of aliases. She had assembled her own case file, complete with annotations in a neat, looping hand. "I'll admit," he said slowly, "this reads like the workings of a career fraudster. But insurance records can be hard to acquire without warrants. This alias, Jacques Morel. Do we have confirmation it's Vaughan?" Verity nodded. The notary in Marseille described a crescent-shaped scar on his forearm. "I've seen it myself. Vaughan said it came from a motorbike accident. He has others. On his wrist and collarbone, which he claimed came from a crash years ago. But what clinched it was a signature. I compared a letter Eleanor had shown me with a marriage record in Lisbon. Identical handwriting. He's clever, but sloppy in his vanity." Linton tapped the folder thoughtfully. "Interpol will be interested. I'll contact them and freeze his bank activity. What's his current status?" Verity's voice was calm but urgent. "He was packing up last night, preparing to flee. I don't know what delayed him." Perhaps an unexpected call or last-minute document. But if he isn't gone already, he will be soon. Linton stood. Then let's not waste time, he said. She arrived back in Little Davington just after lunch, taking a taxi from the station straight to Bramble Cottage. She half expected the house to be empty. The window shuttered, the car gone, but it was still there. She knocked, firmly this time. After a pause, the door opened. "Miss Loxley," Charles said, clearly surprised. "Again? You didn't leave after all?" she asked, stepping inside without invitation. "I meant to," he said, closing the door behind her, "but I was delayed. Something with my travel documents." Tedious bureaucracy. The living room was pristine, too pristine. No signs of life. No half-drunk tea, no scattered papers. It didn't look lived in so much as prepared for a final inspection. "I thought I'd say goodbye," Verity said lightly. "You've kept things so tidy." Charles offered a tight smile. "I like order. I find it comforting in uncertain times." "Tell me," she said, walking slowly around the room, "was it your idea to walk down to the stream that morning? Or Eleanor's?" He paused, the mask slipping just slightly. "She liked the sound of the water," he said. "Found it peaceful." "Peaceful," Verity repeated, turning to face him. "And yet she slipped. No scream, no struggle. You told the constable it was an accident." His voice took on a hard edge. "I hardly think this is appropriate," he began. "I think," Verity said, cutting him off softly, "that Eleanor didn't scream because she trusted you. Until the very last moment." Charles's eyes narrowed. "Why are you really here?" he demanded. "To offer you a choice," she said. "I've spoken with the authorities. They know about Lisbon, Marseille, Prague. Your bank accounts are flagged. If you try to leave, you'll be stopped." His jaw clenched. "You don't understand what you've done." He spat out. "Oh, I do," she said. "You've made a life out of erasing women. But this time, one of us was paying attention." There was a sound from outside, the crunch of boots on gravel. Charles turned toward the window, his face paling. Moments later, Constable Davies entered the doorway, followed by 2 uniformed officers. "Mr. Vaughan," Davies said, voice steady, "we'll need you to come with us. There are questions you must answer." Charles turned to Verity, fury flashing in his eyes. "You think this is over?" He growled. "No," she said. "It's only just beginning." The officers flanked him as he was led out the door, shoulders tight with resistance, but no protest on his lips. Verity stood alone in the center of the room. The silence felt heavier now, not from grief, but from release. Justice had taken its first breath. Still, she felt the weight of unfinished business. There were more names in her notes, more threads to follow. The trap had closed, and this time it would not open again. Chapter 10. Justice Served. The days following Charles Vaughan's arrest passed in a blur of telegrams, formal statements, and a flurry of hushed conversations across Little Davington. Though the villagers were by nature cautious with gossip, the sight of 3 constables escorting Mr. Vaughan from Bramble Cottage had set tongues wagging from the bakehouse to the vicar's gate. What had begun as hushed curiosity was now unmistakable. Something foul had been afoot. Verity Loxley returned to the vicarage, exhausted but resolute. Her room, tucked just above the study, had become a haven of sorts, a quiet place for her thoughts to unfold. The case was far from over, but a critical piece had locked into place. Vaughan was in custody, and with the growing mountain of evidence, extradition and a full investigation into his European trail of aliases and marriages were already underway. But Verity could not rest. On the 3rd morning after the arrest, she sat by the vicarage fire, sifting once more through her annotated notes. There were other women, not just Eleanor or the unfortunate rider in Ireland. At least 2 more had surfaced. A widow in Belgium who had died of apparent food poisoning mere months after naming her husband as sole beneficiary to a substantial estate, and another, a young Swiss woman, who had drowned in Lake Geneva during their honeymoon. The pattern was undeniable. Each woman had married a charming man who seemed ideal. Each had signed insurance papers weeks or days before their untimely deaths. And in each case, Charles Vaughan, under some variation of a name, had been the grieving husband who retreated quietly from view after the funerals. Verity had begun corresponding with a contact at Interpol, Inspector Weiss, who confirmed that they had long suspected a serial fraudster operating across Western Europe. But lacking concrete proof or coordination between jurisdictions, they had failed to connect the dots. Until now. She closed her notebook and rose from her chair. Outside, the morning fog clung low over the hedgerows, and the lane toward Bramble Cottage shimmered with dew. Though the house was now sealed under police authority, Verity felt drawn there once more, not to investigate, but to reflect. As she approached the little cottage, the countryside fell into an uneasy silence. Bramble Cottage sat like a doll's house set for a final performance. No smoke curled from the chimney. No laughter or soft piano drifted from within. It was a place emptied of pretense. She stepped carefully onto the garden path. Near the front stoop, a single daffodil, late for the season, bent in the breeze. For a moment, she thought of Eleanor's hopeful eyes, her girlish letter seeking guidance, the tremor in her voice when she had spoken of Charles. A woman in love. A woman deceived. The front door was locked, of course. But Verity sat on the stone wall beside the gate and took from her coat a folded envelope. It was Eleanor's letter, the one she had kept, with its hesitant ink and confessions of uncertainty. She read it again, not as a clue, but as a memory. I know it's all so sudden, Miss Loxley, but Charles is unlike anyone I've ever known. He listens. He makes me feel seen. And still, I wonder, is it foolish to marry so quickly? Am I mistaking charm for something deeper? I do hope I'm not a fool. A lump rose in Verity's throat. She folded the letter and slipped it back into her pocket. No, Eleanor had not been a fool. She had been hopeful. And in that hope, she had fallen into the trap. A sound behind her broke the moment. Constable Davies approached, his boots crunching lightly on the gravel. "Miss Loxley," he said with a nod. "Thought I might find you here." She offered a faint smile. "Old habits, Constable." He nodded at the cottage. "They've begun cataloging everything. Inspector Linton says it's likely Vaughan will face charges in at least 3 countries, possibly more." Verity looked out across the fields. "He won't be charming his way out of this one." Davies hesitated. "There's something else. We found a photograph behind the dresser upstairs. Must have fallen down the back. It's Eleanor. She's standing beside Charles in what looks like a garden abroad. Portugal, maybe. She's smiling, but something in her eyes, like she knew." Verity didn't respond at once. Then she said quietly, "Grief wears many masks. So does fear." Davies shifted. "There's talk that you should work with us more formally. A few in Kingsbridge think your instincts could be useful." Verity raised an eyebrow. "You mean, become an unofficial advisor?" He shrugged. "Stranger things have happened." She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But a moment later, she stood, brushing dust from her coat. "There will be more," she said. "People like Vaughan rarely stop after one." Davies nodded. "Then I hope we'll be ready." They turned back toward the village, the cottage behind them standing still and silent, its secrets stripped bare. And as the path curved toward the vicarage, the mist began to lift. Epilogue. 3 months later, the village of Little Davington had returned to its customary quiet. Its hedgerows tamed, the market stalls humming once again with produce and chatter. The ripples of the Vaughan case had spread far beyond their boundaries. But in time, Even the most shocking scandal is absorbed by the rhythm of rural life. Verity Loxley remained at the vicarage, though she had declined, at least formally, any official role with the constabulary. Her work, she said, was best done in the margins, in the silences where others missed what mattered most. Still, her correspondence with Inspector Linton and Interpol's Inspector Weiss continued, and occasionally a letter arrived addressed only to Miss V. Loxley, Little Davington, bearing stamps from foreign cities and inquiries that hinted at more puzzles to be solved. Charles Vaughan was in custody in Geneva, awaiting trial for the murder of Lisette Moreau, his Swiss bride, and facing extradition demands from both Belgium and Ireland. The case had drawn international headlines, unmasking a man who, for nearly a decade, had used charm and legality as his weapons. The insurance firms involved had quietly begun reviewing past claims, and policies had been rewritten in response to the scandal. Procedures tightened, backgrounds checked, lives perhaps saved. At the edge of the village green, a small bench had been placed by the women's circle in memory of Eleanor. It bore a modest brass plaque which said, "In memory of kindness, hope, and courage. May truth always follow where love leads." Verity sometimes sat there in the early evening, notebook on her lap, teacup in hand. She had become, without seeking it, a keeper of stories, the quiet kind that begin with a question no one else thinks to ask. And when the breeze stirred through the linden trees, rustling the grass at her feet, she listened, not for whispers of scandal, but for the truths hidden beneath the surface of ordinary lives. Because Verity Loxley now knew this much for certain. Evil often wore a smile, but so did justice. And both required careful watching. If you enjoyed this cozy mystery and love solving whodunits, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss a twist. More village crimes and clever sleuths await.